everybody, I'm Sarah and today I have with me some Native American flutes. I was lucky enough to sit down with the amazing Native American flute player Ron Warren. He also has a YouTube channel. He was so generous as to send me some flutes to try, sit down with me, explain a whole bunch of information about these incredible instruments. Let's get into it.
Hi, I'm Ron and I'm a flute player. My name is Ron Warren, and I am enrolled at Chota Cherokee. We are a state recognized band of Cherokee with our lands and offices in northern Alabama. I've been playing flute for quite a while at this point, and it's been a really beautiful and fascinating journey, and I've met lots of exciting and kind and wonderful musicians along the way. Long ago, there was an old man living in the village, and he had lived there for so long that many of his friends and relatives had either gone to different villages or moved on to spirit world, and he was starting to spend too much time alone. And that made him sad, and his body started to weaken, and then to make things even worse, he got really sick. Now, this probably doesn't happen to you, but sometimes when I get sick, I can get kind of grumpy and grouchy, difficult to be around. It's happened to this old guy. So it became kind of a vicious circle. He would get grumpy and grouchy, and that would make him feel more sorry for himself and make him more depressed, and his body would weaken further, and that would make him feel even more grumpy and grouchy. You get the idea. It was not a good situation. Now, one day he was sitting in his house, not feeling terribly well, feeling kind of unhappy with life in general, and suddenly his friend Dalala appeared at the window. Now, in English, Dalala is known as woodpecker. And Woodpecker said to the old man, "Hey, come with me down to the river. I have something to show you." Well, of course, he had to be grumpy and grouse about it first, but eventually he went. And when they got to the river, Dalala showed him how to find just the right piece of river cane, how to hollow it out in just the right way, how to slowly roast it over the fire to dry it out and give it a beautiful color. And then, since Dalala was so good at poking holes in things, he showed the old man right where to poke all the holes. Then he said, "All right, pick that up and blow on it. See what happens." So the old man did. He was delighted. He had never heard such a beautiful sound in his life, so he took his new special piece of river cane home with him, and every day he would blow on it for just a little bit. Well, sure enough, after several weeks of blowing on his flute every day, his spirits began to lift. He wasn't so depressed, and his body began to have a chance to heal. And after several more weeks of playing on his flute every day, the old man was feeling pretty good. Body is strong, spirit is strong. One day he's sitting playing, having a very nice time. Suddenly, there was a knock at his door. Now, he had not heard a knock on his door for many, many months, so he rushed to see who was there. And when he opened the door, what do you suppose he saw? The entire village gathered around his house to hear the beautiful new sounds. So the old man had been healed in his body. He had been healed in his spirit. He had been gathered back into his community and had many new friends, all because of Dalala's beautiful gift. And that's the way the story was told to me, which is one way we have saying that's the end of the story. Right? So that's our tradition of flute playing. We like to use river cane, which is just like bamboo. It's just that it's indigenous to the Americas. And we tend to use it as a social instrument, hanging out with your friends or sitting out in the woods and just improvising and chatting with the birds, whatever.
Yeah.
Now, I was in New Mexico one time, and in Santa Fe, there's a real kind of touristy bit of area downtown. I was just walking around, and there was an entire store window full of native flutes. So I had to go in, of course. And I asked the guy, the proprietor, if I could play, and he said, sure. And I grabbed a flute and play. It turned out he was a player also, and he grabbed a flute, and we jammed together for a while. He was Lakota. Right, so he asked if I could tell him a story from my people, so I shared him a version of that story, and then he told me a version of the Lakota story, and it's his story to tell. But to just kind of summarize a little bit, it involves a young man, right, and the young man is interested in a young woman who won't give him the time of day. So clearly he needs love medicine. Elk is the carrier of the love medicine, so he heads out looking for an elk. And after adventures and dreams and all kinds of things, Woodpecker comes to him in a dream and shows him how to make a cedar flute. And on the way back to the village, the people hear it, they all come out. And as you can imagine, the ending of the story is that he gets the girl, right? Because the flute was the love medicine that he needed. So for the Lakota, it's cedar. Their favorite material is cedar. It tends to be a young man's courting instrument. And for a lot of the Plains people, that's that way. I heard a Kiowa guy say one time, if you found that special someone, you put your flute away and don't play it so much anymore because it's so effective, it will get you in trouble. So the traditions really vary wildly, as you can imagine, because, we're talking hundreds of different cultures just in what's now the United States. And you get down into, like the Mayans and Aztecs have a long tradition of fired ceramic flutes. And you get further south and you start running into Cana territory, like a notched and blown flute, and things that are like panpipes. So many different traditions. So we're working basically in kind of a modern version of a plains and eastern woodlands flute. So if we think bamboo or river cane, and maybe a little bit more intimate kind of sound, that we would associate that maybe more with the eastern woodlands, and more of a cedar flute and a bright, chirpy, courting kind of instrument, maybe associate a little bit more with the plains. Yeah. And just like, I've heard on your videos, you'll talk about how recorder fingerings will differ depending on whether it's a German Baroque recorder or whatever. And I love the video you did where you like, here's a Renaissance style recorder with a larger bore.
Right.
And for my ears, that really kind of pulled the recorder into native flute sound world a little bit. It was really nice.
Yeah. Wow. I have so many questions and so many different avenues to go down. It's fascinating. Where should we start? I'd love to know about how they're built, the different materials, the tuning, how they're played, where the music comes from, how you would play it socially.
Wow, okay. yeah. I know. So much. Okay, so...
where would you like to start?
I think I sent you a cedar flute by Colin Peterson, the little blonde-colored B flat, and this is also by Colin Peterson, and it's also in B flat, so it might be a good place to start. So, I don't know. Yeah, you've taken the block off. Excellent. So what you see there, you see then that it's not unlike a recorder in that we have a block that gets the air to where it needs to be, right, to the cutting edge. It's just that ours sits on top. All right. So we have solid material between these two holes, right? And when we blow into the flute, air actually leaves from the top hole and then the block guides it through the windway to the cutting edge, which is right here.
Okay, that's how it works.
Yeah. Now, in on a river cane flute, or you have a bamboo version of this, uh, river cane, just like bamboo, has nodes inside. And so
Right.
the node is left, right? It's much tougher material. And that becomes the wall between the two chambers of the flute.
Mm.
All
So
right.
it's kind of thicker on the inside here.
Yeah, right, right. So Jim left the nodes all the way down the instrument, but if you look up where the block is, right between the two holes, it's kind of covered with the wrap that you have for the block. But
Yeah.
if you remove that wrap, you'll see a node wall sitting
Oh.
between the two holes.
And is this leather? What would this be made of?
It can be made of many different things, but it's usually leather. A lot of makers like to use deer hide. So the sound world that the flute makes can depend on a number of things. Like, do you have the Ken Light flute handy? Okay, now you can see on that one again. If maybe good to take the block off for a second,
Okay.
so that people can see that here a really interesting adaptation that the Lakota made and the Northern Plains makers make is that they use a metal spacer plate in
Oh,
the windway. So the windway actually goes across that, and then the cutting edge is metal here instead of
right.
just wood or bamboo. So that really changes the character of the sound a lot. So the character of the sound depends a lot on how much air is going through that windway, how
Mhm.
fast is it going, right? And how sharp is that cutting edge. The wood can make a difference too. We like cedar for a reason. It's a soft wood and it vibrates beautifully.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's they're kind of designed as outdoor instruments, and you just take it outdoors sometime. You'll be amazed how well the sound actually travels. I mean, I would imagine recorder does well outside too, but I don't know.
It depends. The
Yeah.
higher, wider instruments, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. If they're
Okay.
quite low and soft, then not so much.
Uh-huh. So for a lot of people, because cedar in almost all of our traditions, for almost all of us, is a sacred wood, then cedar can become a really important wood for flute making. In fact, when I was first learning to play, there was an Ojibwa, Anishinaabe fellow living in town, and he very kindly invited me over for the evening just to talk flutes and hang out. And I had a cedar flute along that night, and his what he wanted he showed me. Okay, here's basic fingerings. Here's how the thing works.
Mhm.
Right now, go sit in the woods for 3 days. He wasn't going to tell me what I should play. Right. What he cared about is that I had a cedar flute in my hands,
Mhm.
which you do right at the moment too. Right. Cedar's a sacred wood. Even when the tree is fallen, the spirit of the wood remains. So every time we breathe into a flute, we're breathing life back into the wood. So our task as flute players is not to try to tell the flute what to do. It's to be connected with all the beauty around us and listen for what wants to be shared through the flute today. So even if we're playing a song we've played 100 times, if we're really connected, it'll be different today
Mhm.
than we played it yesterday.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, I know you're a good improviser, so you know what that's about. And like you might be playing even if it's a Telemann sonata, you might be playing mostly the same notes, but you might tongue it differently or do different ornaments or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that for me, that's the goal of a musician to be able to play
Yeah.
how you want to sound on that day.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's that's I think that's a different discipline than just reciting notes off a page, right?
Absolutely.
It's being open in a different kind of way, being available for what needs to happen today. Yeah.
These ones that you've sent, they're in different sizes. So, of
Yes.
course, the smaller ones will sound higher.
Yes. Yeah. Very similar to recorder. It's all
Yeah,
about bore size and length of the tube and all of
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
how would that be? For example, the cane ones. Would it also be to do with just how the cane has grown, or
Yeah.
is there
Um,
a um a certain key.
Yeah, this is a river cane flute by the same maker that you're holding, but they're
Hmm.
pitched about a half step apart, so it really won't work for us to play them together. But what one way we back in the day, one way we had of scaling out a flute was that the flute can be about as long as your arm,
Ah,
right?
yeah.
And the distance from the cutting edge to the top finger hole can be about the width of your hand.
Oh,
The distance between each finger hole about the width of your thumb,
okay.
and similar for the bore size. Obviously, if I had a flute made to my body specs and you had one made to your body specs, we'd end up with different sounding flutes,
Mm,
right?
right.
But the standardization here is not that all the flutes have to sound the same when they get done, right? What's important is that the flute is in right relationship with the person that's playing the flute.
Yeah.
All right. So I have been in workshops where we've all made river cane flutes that way. And interestingly, I thought because I guess body proportions are close enough, right? That it wasn't like it was 12 tone equal tempered or anything, but the basic scale that everybody played sounded essentially the same interval pattern. Not the same
Mm.
frequencies, of course, but the interval patterns were actually pretty close.
That's what I noticed when I tried them out. I think
Yeah.
this one, the lowest note was around an F, and
Yep.
this one a G.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe I'll try putting the blocks back on. So,
Okay. Yeah, now all of the flutes that I sent to you, I would consider in terms of the tuning to be modern hybrid kinds of flutes in that they are made with the intent of, like Colin, when he decided that flute was going to be pitched on B flat, he set it up and he targeted B flat and made the flute accordingly, right?
right.
Which is not a traditional way of doing things. In fact, our the person that most considered to be our greatest contemporary Cherokee flute maker, at least Eastern band, he said he had been taught by his grandfather, who'd been taught by his grandfather the old way of scaling things out. And he said the first time somebody came to him and said, "Can you make me a flute in E?" he had no idea what they were talking about because that's just not a musical term, right?
Right.
But he said, but we are very practical people. So as soon as I figured out he would pay me $500 to make a flute in E, I figured out how to make a flute in E. Yeah. So all of these are. I mean, I've played Collins flutes with classical orchestras and with Celtic band and my own band when we're all together. Well, when we were all together, we haven't been together for a while at this point, but was we had a lot of blues influence and rock and ska and reggae and that kind of and so I like to say that our flutes are as versatile and as expressive as any instrument on the planet.
Yeah.
They're just like any other instrument. We have our limitations, right? Maybe a primary one being the range. We have like where recorder you can get 2 octaves plus, right?
Yeah.
But on ours, for most of them, a tenth is about what you're going to get. So
Okay.
closer, I guess, to Renaissance recorder. I remember you saying it was around a 12th for
Right.
Renaissance.
Would you
Yeah,
mind demonstrating so that we
sure.
can hear?
Sure, I'm gonna grab the B flat since you have a Colin B flat also. Most players nowadays call basic scale on our flute. The ring finger, the top hand, doesn't matter which hand you have on top, but the ring finger on the top hand stays down, right? And
Okay.
otherwise, it's just a simple walk up. And of course, you will recognize that as minor pentatonic scale, right? Now, we by using cross fingerings, we can get a full chromatic octave starting from here.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the notes some of the intervals are going to sound really, yeah, right? It's not equal tempered at all. Right, you get in the upper register and all bets are off on these guys.
Yeah.
Even the same maker from flute to flute, it's very, very different.
Right.
But even having just that octave allows you to really get to different places. probably 90% of the music you hear recorded on these is in what we call that basic minor pentatonic mode sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we actually can approximate a lot of things. So a
Wow.
quasi-Mixolydian feel, and if you get really ambitious, you can even try half-holing at the bottom. Not always reliable, but you can mess with it and try, right? And then we also, because of that octave, like I really love European medieval and Renaissance music, so it's really fun on these to get someplace like this.
Beautiful.
Right, so we're like right in Hypodorian at that point, you know. So you can get to a lot of different places and approximate a lot of familiar modes just by exploring those outside those cross fingerings. So I mean, of course, that's really familiar for a recorder player anyway.
Yeah. I'd love to try.
That's the block for the Ken Light flute.
Here we go. This one.
Yeah, and that's the block for the Jim Gilliland flute. You got one left. There you go. Okay. Now the little tail of it needs to be towards the top of the flute.
Towards the top.
There you go.
And the holes.
And then you'll
decorative?
Yes. Yep. I'm sorry.
The holes are for decoration or for looping?
They are for decoration, yeah. And you'll sometimes see makers make very, very elaborate blocks, especially if they're making something for themselves and they have a special relationship with an animal of some kind. You might see bear or eagle sitting on top of a flute, something like that, which is very, very beautiful. Yeah. So they can have for some people can have a symbolic meaning, but they have that really functional meaning too, is that it needs to be seated in the right place for the air to get to the cutting edge. Right? And the way I like to set it, I don't know how close I can get here. You want the bottom of the block to be at the top of that lower window. And I like to have, just a sliver of wood showing underneath the block. For me, that's kind of an ideal place for the responsiveness of the flute. You get it too far down into the window and it will kind of start overblowing unpredictably, which we don't necessarily want. And of course, if you get it too far back, then you don't get enough air to the cutting edge. It just kind of gets diffuse sounding.
See, and I guess you can adjust it slightly up and down.
Absolutely, yeah. Even once you get it tied on there, you can adjust it. In fact, I have, it's probably a nervous habit, but whenever I'm performing, that's usually like before every tune, I'm checking the block to make sure it's still seated where I want it to be.
Okay, I'm going to give it a try.
Sure.
So it's got a big sound, lots of dynamics. Ron has sent me his own method book to work with, and in there it describes the basic scale. One, two, three, four, five, six. And this is described the same way on all flutes, regardless of their key or their lowest pitch. You should be able to take any flute and play any piece on it. If I'm going to relate this to the recorder, our lowest note is a B flat. So it would be like playing. Ron refers to this as beginner mode, but we can add lots of pitches in between to create different songs. How about... Let's try the next one. So I'm going to add the block. Wow. If I move the block down slightly. Ooh, it's a clearer, stronger tone. Wow. If I move it down really far, we get a very thin, almost reedy tone. And up really far. Very airy. So relating it to the recorder, this flute's lowest note is a G, a minor third lower than this one in B flat. Finally, we're going to go to the last flute. This is the longest, the biggest one. I'm going to add the block. Love this one. I'm going to try and play one of Ron's own compositions. For this, I'm going to need a new scale.
I mean, that's a lot of this is going to feel very, very familiar to you, I would think. You know, I mean, there's a fair amount of crossover in the technique, just in the way we want to stand, the way we want to support the breath. And I've heard you, especially in your more modern pieces, like that cool little the cool avant-garde piece you made for yourself, right?
Yeah.
I remember hearing a YouTube video of you playing that, and you were, as I remember, you were doing some things with changing vibrato speeds and things like that. Yeah. So we do that a lot also. It's like one thing I've really noticed, like with some of my classically trained silver flute friends, the vibrato tends to be pretty steady all the time, but we tend to use it much more, say, like a jazz or pop singer, where we'll pull in and use the vibrato more for expressive purposes, and sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's really there, and but that's familiar territory for you also.
Yeah, that's very much like in early music as well. It's an ornament
technique that we use a fair amount that maybe doesn't show up so often in recorder music is something that most of our players will call a chirp or a bark. And you'll often hear it at the end of a note, like if you listen to much powwow drumming, you'll hear the singers do this kind of thing a lot. And I think a lot of what we do on our flute comes out of vocal traditions, really. And in fact, I sometimes like to tell people that the flute gives me a singing voice that I most definitely do not have otherwise. Unlike you're a very good singer, but. Okay, so the idea of a bark is that we might get to the end of a phrase, and if you hear a powwow singer hold a note for a while, and then sometimes they'll give a little vocal pop at the top of it, and our approximation of it sounds something like this. So that little pop at the end. So the way that we do that is normally one or both of these fingers, of the top fingers, when we get to the end of the note and get ready to do the bark, one or both of those fingers lifts. You give a little push with the diaphragm and then stop the air. All right, so. That's it exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you can use that wherever it feels right. I mean, traditionally our music isn't written down so much as you find somebody who knows the tunes and they sing it to you till you can sing it back, and then you figure out how you want to play it on your flute, right? So that typically, like even if I'm writing down something to put into a book, I oftentimes won't try to write down the barks. I suppose you could put like little, sometimes I'll put a little X note head that looks like a grace note, at the end of a note, right? And so you kind of get the idea, but it doesn't have to happen, and it can happen in a lot of different ways. Like if it's a really energetic tune, you might really want to hit that, right? But if it's a gentle lyric kind of tune, you might want to just barely touch it, or even just like let it fall away. So it's just a very, very delicate, little thing. Yeah, yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah. And if you want something really dramatic, you can even kind of push it and extend it. So with little finger slides and a little extra air before you push it off. Yeah, so it's just kind of fun to play with, and you can find your own ways of doing it that work for the music you're making on any given day, and it will change from day to day, and all of that is fine.
And I'm hearing some. Do you use the tongue at all? I heard a bit more.
Yeah, we use the tongue very. It's very much like recorder tonguing, single, double, triple. The one thing that one effect that I really enjoy, of course, we can do the flutter tonguing with the tip of the tongue up front, but on these instruments I really like a fluttery sound that's back in the throat. It feels like you're gargling, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and for me it gives me a lot more control. It's like for that. I mean, it's going to sound aggressive. But if I get it back in the throat, I can really change the dynamic and speed it up and slow it down and do that kind of thing. So
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm having real problems keeping this finger down.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, you don't have to, but yeah. So there are plenty of fingerings that have that finger up, but for what we call basic scale. In fact, I won't bother to get it out right now, but some of our makers make 5-hole flutes instead of 6, and that there won't even be a hole there.
Okay.
You can still get all the same notes on it as you can a 6-hole flute. It's just different cross fingerings that you have to use to get the outside notes.
Right.
But on that flute, then it's just basic scale is just a simple rip up and down.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about keeping that finger down. Yeah.
And I love that the distance between the 2 lower holes, is that a minor third?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, and depending on the flute, you can half hole and kind of fill that in a little bit. But on a lot of my flutes, that's not really reliable. The sound can get really wonky really quick. And it's hard to really zero in. You have those nice double holes down at the bottom of a recorder that give you those nice clean half steps, right? and that's not really available here. But,
no.
Yeah.
And then these holes at the bottom.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah, these are just tuning holes. Okay. All right. So this determines the functional end of the flute. So if you have excuse me for just a second. Colin wanted to do a line of signature flutes with me, and we designed this one together. So it's Raven being followed by wolves.
Wow.
Right, so you can see that here's the tuning hole. That's the functional end of the flute. So you can build as much as you want down here beyond that, and it's not going to affect the pitch because this is the functional end of the flute. Yeah. Yeah, and I get, in reality, you only need one of them, but most flute makers will make four for the four sacred directions.
And the distance between from the top to the first hole?
Yeah, that can vary wildly, and it doesn't really affect the tuning of the flute so much, because the functional length of the flute is from that wall inside. Down to either the bottom of the flute or a tuning hole if you have one.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of flexibility.
Yes, there is. Yeah, tremendous amount of flexibility. And one of the things I love about our tradition is that every maker will have their own thing, and it's like we got the resin recorders that you were recommending one time, Sarah and I did, so that we could play a bit together. And yeah, man, they are locked right in. You can tell they came out of the same machine someplace, right? But with our flutes, every maker is going to do things their own kind of way, and they're going to have their own sound world, and even from flute to flute. It's like, I have a lot of Colin flutes at this point, and those outside fingerings on some of his flutes, like on some of his flutes, I can consider this to be an alternate fingering for this. They sound almost identical. But on this flute, they're almost a half step apart. So the kind of standardization in manufacturing that we're accustomed to with modern recorders and modern silver flutes and keyboards and that kind of stuff isn't really part of our tradition, and I really like that it's not that way.
You get to know each instrument as an individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've heard you talk about the same thing with some of your recorders too, that here's a new maker I'm trying out, or here's a new design, and this and that and the other. And
absolutely.
Especially some of you get some really wild, more recently made recorders, like the Uber monster. Yeah,
the giant ones. Yeah,
right.
I love that, and I love like you say about the makers putting their own personality into the instruments.
Yeah.
So how does that work if two players meet one another and they start to play? How do you work with things like tuning and pitch and finding a way together?
That can be a challenge we do have early English accounts of being greeted by entire villages of Cherokee playing on flutes. And they began after a while to call it the peace flute because it meant come on in, hang out, But unfortunately, there aren't really any descriptions of what it sounded like of them all playing together, whether they were all pitched the same or not. I'm guessing they were not, And so nowadays, when we meet up with other players, because so many people carry kind of modern hybrid flutes with those kind of slightly adjusted tunings so that we can get along with other instruments, it'll be like, oh, well, let's grab an A flute or something like that. And we can say the same thing to a guitar player, if we're going to jam together. It's like, okay, I'm playing an E flute today, and kind of fill them in on what that means for me, and then away we go. Yeah. Also, it's like Philip Glass's second piano concerto was written for a friend of mine named Paul Barnes, and the second movement actually has an extensive Native American flute solo in it. So it's like, and so it's with orchestra. So at that point, I have to bring flutes that I know will be in the ballpark. I think one of the things that's really cool is if you're playing with, say, a modern orchestra, and they're all thinking basically 12-tone equal temperament, and my instrument isn't that. It can be really a beautiful expressive moment where I'm somewhere in the cracks and they're, somewhere else, and eventually we'll find each other again, and it all works out in the end. But yeah, it's a reminder that, we're coming from different places, but we can find a way to make things work. And that's one of the things that I really have enjoyed exploring over the years. I was alumni resident in artist in residence at Music Omai in New York, which is a wonderful one. It's a place you ought to go sometime. Actually, it's they invite 12, 15 musicians every year from all over the planet, many different traditions of playing. Wow. But everybody has to be kind of doing their own thing and be able to improvise. And they throw you out on a farm, beautiful farm in upstate New York that's been turned into dance studios and art studios and this and that. And we all hang out and jam and make new music together for 2 weeks and then go do a concert someplace. Right. Wow. So it's great fun. But one year I was there, we were playing an improvisation game. Right. And the improvisation game was throw everybody's names in a hat. And then somebody says, hey, I want to hear a trio. And you pull out 3 names. Okay, you guys. And it doesn't matter what instruments they have, what tradition they're from. They have to make it work. So the first night we did this, we were starting off and someone said, I'd like to hear a duo. And the first 2 names to come out of the hat were mine and the guy who was a Highlands bagpipe player. Yeah. Now, fortunately, he was a real outside-the-box player, and he had the brilliant idea of turning off the drones and working on just the chanter, and he started doing these really beautiful, ethereal, harmonic, whistly kinds of things. And I was like, oh, I can get there. And we had a lovely time just improvising in those parts of our instruments for the night. Yeah. So there are lots of ways that you can. That's a very exciting thing for me. Yeah. When people who know who they are coming from different traditions, and let's make something new that can't have existed before.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. What about in a more traditional setting? What other instruments would typically be played together?
Not much. Maybe a drum, maybe bells, maybe shakers. But for a lot of our traditional players, the flute is a solo instrument. You don't even play it with other flute players. So, and in the cultures like Lakota tradition, where it has a really specific function, more traditional players will still do that. And so I've met Lakota traditional players who, it's like, I play my flute. I don't need anything else, right? And they will even get a little bit out of shape if they see, for example, a woman playing a flute, because in Lakota tradition, it's a man's courting instrument. It's not a woman's instrument, right? But I know Cherokee women who are flute makers. We don't have that tradition about the flute. So, pretty much anybody is welcome to play a flute in our tradition. So it varies wildly depending, you get into the Southwest and there's a long tradition of end-blown flutes there where the technique is much closer to shakuhachi than it is to what we're playing now. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of them, those are really significant ceremonial flutes that maybe only come out once every couple of years, maybe, and a designated person has been trained to do what needs to be done on that flute, and otherwise it just isn't used. Mm-hmm. So it, the one thing that is, it's an unfortunate tendency, especially in the media historically, like movies and all that kind of stuff, kind of portray indigenous American culture as though it's this kind of monolithic thing. Like I've even asked, do you speak Indian? What does that even mean? So it's it's tremendously varied, even within what's now called the United States, but then you get up into the First Nations folks in Canada, and you get along some of the Pacific coastal people. They're really into whistles and bird whistles and things like that. And you get down further south, it's like along the Amazon basin, bird whistles are a really big thing too. And some of that made its way into modern samba music and stuff like that. So, yeah, so it's incredibly varied and incredibly rich. And what we're doing is just one small little part of that.
Right. Yeah.
But I think what happened with this particular style of flute is that we had a couple of people in the 80s and 90s, particularly R.C. Nakai, whose playing crossed over and really kind of became very popular in the dominant culture. And a lot of people who were not indig started playing the flute. And in some ways that was a really good thing because it led to a really big revival of flute making. When I started looking for my first flute, it was really, really hard to find anybody that was even making good flutes, And so we have a lot of situations like RC's primary flute maker for his entire career, Ken Light, the guy with the metal spacer plate. I sent you one of his flutes.
Yeah.
He's not indig, but he studied traditional Lakota flutes very, very carefully and is doing kind of modern versions of those, and he does it very beautifully, and they record incredibly well. And so RC has played his flutes for decades.
Wow.
So there are, like I mentioned one of our really important Cherokee flute makers earlier. He's moved on, so but there's still some of his flutes around. But that's somebody who had been taught traditionally by his grandfather, who had been taught by his grandfather. So there's somebody coming from a real grounded traditional base.
Wow.
So there's a big spectrum of activity going on, but what's really exciting to me is that the tradition is we still have people who are making Cherokee flutes the old way. We have people who are making flutes that I can go play with a classical orchestra and I know it'll work. We don't really have mentors in our tradition, but I've had the chance to learn from R.C. Nakai and have played with him on a number of occasions. And one of the things that I like to think of myself kind of following his path of, hey, our flute can go anywhere. Our flute can get along with any kind of music, can make any kind of music.
So if someone was wanting to start learning, how would one go about that?
In your part of the world, I think there are even flute circles now. And I know that I seem to remember having been contacted by a flute circle in the Netherlands somewhere. And, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure what all the reasons are, but apparently Native American culture is a really big thing in Germany. So there are little pockets of places where you can actually, like I was online with a student in Vancouver, Canada, not long ago, and she had a flute on order that was coming from Australia. So there are really good flute makers in Australia also. So there are little pockets of places, and you can just kind of snoop around, and I know it can be increasingly difficult to deal with stuff coming from the States. So, but there are several good resources in the States. Like my flute maker, Colin Peterson, is still making, and his website is woodlandvoices.com, so you can get something directly from him. There's one of our really fine younger flute players, Jonny Lipwood, has an online store called Horizons. And he deals with flutes, so a good variety of flutes there, and you can kind of talk with him a bit, and he'll point you in the right direction for a flute that might work well for you. I often suggest to starting players that they start with a flute in A, and it's because the finger holes are close enough together that even if you have smaller hands, it's going to feel very, very comfortable. For a lot of people, the sound of the flute, because the sounds can vary so much from flute to flute, it's really important that if you're ordering a flute online or something like that, talk with the maker, and most of them are pretty cooperative about this. But if the flute arrives and the sound world just doesn't work for you, can I try a different one? You know, because they're not as standardized as modern silver flutes or anything like that, or somebody buying a beginner resin recorder that's going to have a pretty predictable sound, right? I mean, depending on the maker who's made it. But that's really not the case with our flute. So it's kind of important to have enough of a relationship with the maker that you can say, hey, if this isn't working for me, can I try a different flute? Of course, the ideal is that you are at a tribal gathering someplace and there are flute makers there setting up, vending their flutes, and you can actually get them in your hands and try them out and that kind of thing. But just about any place you are at this point, you can find other players. And that's what's really fun, I think, for music making, is to find other players and make music with them.
Yeah, so fascinating.
Oh, there was one other question you asked that is a really important one. Where does the music come from? Right. We for the most part, we are not a repertoire tradition. It's like if you're, it's like I have my instructional books that you recommended for a recorder, and I've got them back there, and it has these nice pieces written down and everything, and I can go out and get THOMANN sonatas or whatever. That doesn't really exist for us. The one place that it does is if there's a particular traditional use, like the Lakota have a courting song society. And if you are in need of a courting song and your flute is not giving you one, you can go and they will teach you some songs and help you out, and then you can translate those onto the flute. Now, I've learned how some of those songs work just because of what it will teach me about the flute, but I don't share those at all because it's not my tradition. They're not my songs to share. So you actually have to go sit with the society, and they need to say, okay, you're ready, So if you want a repertoire, you basically have to build one.
Wow.
Through making your own songs, through improvising. So improvisation becomes a really, really important part of things for us as modern players, because okay, you can. I mean, there are resources available. Like a lot of people who come to native flute from classical flute like it, that they can go out and find like a book like the Winter Songs that I put. That's why I made that. Is that okay? If you're accustomed to reading tunes and you want some tunes that you can play on your flute, here are some that might be familiar to you. Here's how they work. That kind of thing. So there are a lot of resources available like that now, but traditionally that's not really how it works.
So you would really go and be part of the community and learn them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And a really silly question, when you say the songs would be by singing, and then you would.
Well, traditionally, yeah. It's like, I had a Cherokee friend who was a storyteller and knew songs and song patterns that I didn't know. And so he would invite me over and he would sing them at me until I could sing them back. And then we'd sing back and forth. And then once I had those, if I wanted to find some way of putting them on flute, I could. Right. But that's how I learned the songs.
Do you think we could play together briefly?
Could trade phrases or something like that if you would like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Let's use the little B flat then.
B flat. Yeah.
Okay. So the way I usually do this with people that I'm working with is we will start just passing long tones on the bottom note back and forth to kind of get the breathing hooked up. You don't need that. Then we might just play some basic scale patterns to try a few tonguing things. You're fine with that too. So then what we'll do is we'll go into, I'll play a short phrase, and you are welcome to either repeat it or do a variation of it, or answer with a completely different phrase, whatever you feel like doing. Okay? All right. Thank you.
So much fun. Wow.
Well, thank you so much for everything.
Sure. Oh, thank you. It was a very good time. Really appreciate the invitation.
That was it for this week. Please check out in the description links to all of Ron's online resources, his YouTube channel, and also Native American flute music is something that I actually know very little about. So if you have recommendations that you'd like to share with other people, please do so in the comments. As always, you can subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face down here in the corner. Over here's the Team Recorder Patreon where you can choose to support the channel, and here's some more videos. Thanks for watching, have a great day. Bye!